Before Donald Trump met with Ukrainian President Zelensky, he called Vladimir Putin. This wasn't consultation with an ally. It was coordination with someone whose interests aligned against the person Trump was about to meet. The call wasn't exceptional. It was pattern. And the pattern reveals something fundamental about how authoritarian leaders operate in the modern world. They've built a coordination network that functions as a shadow alliance, sharing information, providing mutual support, and collectively resisting democratic pressure. This isn't a formal treaty organization like NATO. It's more dangerous than that. It's a flexible network where dictators coordinate based on shared interests without the constraints or commitments of formal alliances. Putin and Xi Jinping meet dozens of times annually. Putin and Lukashenko of Belarus coordinate weekly. Xi and Kim Jong-un align on North Korea policy. When Venezuela faced collapse, Russia and China provided economic lifelines. When Belarus protests threatened Lukashenko, Putin intervened with security forces and financial support. When democratic pressure mounts anywhere, the network activates. Understanding this network requires examining its structure, the mechanisms of coordination, the benefits it provides to members, and the vulnerabilities that might limit its effectiveness. Because this coordination fundamentally shapes global politics in ways that traditional alliance frameworks can't explain. The network's structure is deliberately informal. Unlike NATO's Article 5 or the mutual defense treaties that structured Cold War blocs, the autocratic network operates through personal relationships between leaders, shared interests against common threats, and flexible coordination that adapts to specific situations without binding commitments. Putin and Xi represent the network's core. Their relationship has deepened dramatically over 2 decades, evolving from pragmatic cooperation to what they describe as a comprehensive strategic partnership. They meet in person frequently, often several times per year, and coordinate positions on virtually every major international issue. In February 2022, weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Putin and Xi declared a partnership with no limits, explicitly positioning their relationship as a counter to Western alliances. The coordination is substantial and specific. Russia and China coordinate UN Security Council vetoes, ensuring that resolutions threatening either nation's interests are blocked. They conduct joint military exercises, naval drills in the South China Sea, bomber patrols near Alaska, army exercises in Russia's Far East. They've integrated payment systems to bypass Western financial networks, created alternatives to SWIFT for international transactions, and developed bilateral trade denominated in rubles and yuan rather than dollars. The economic integration is strategic. China purchases Russian energy, oil, and natural gas, providing revenue that reduces Russian vulnerability to Western sanctions. Russia supplies military technology to China, including advanced aircraft engines and air defense systems that China hasn't fully developed domestically. Trade between Russia and China exceeded $200 billion in 2023 and continues growing as both nations systematically reduce dependence on Western markets. Putin and Lukashenko operate even more closely. Belarus under Lukashenko functions almost as a Russian satellite state, maintaining nominal independence while coordinating comprehensively with Moscow on security, economic, and foreign policy. The 2020 Belarus protests, which nearly toppled Lukashenko, demonstrated the relationship's depth. When hundreds of thousands of Belarusians protested the rigged election that extended Lukashenko's rule, the regime faced potential collapse. Western nations condemned the election fraud and supported protesters, but Putin provided the support Lukashenko needed to survive. Russian media backed Lukashenko's narrative that protests were Western orchestrated. Russian security advisors helped Belarusian forces suppress demonstrations. Russian financial support, billions in loans and subsidies, kept the Belarusian economy functioning despite Western sanctions. Lukashenko survived because Putin decided he would. The Belarus rescue demonstrated the network's value for its members. Lukashenko alone couldn't withstand popular uprising and Western pressure. But integrated into Putin's network, he had access to resources, security expertise, financial support, diplomatic backing that made survival possible. This creates powerful incentives for authoritarian leaders to maintain network relationships, even when domestic populations resist. Xi and Kim Jong-un coordinate on North Korea policy with China, providing the economic lifeline that keeps the Kim regime functional. North Korea faces comprehensive international sanctions that would collapse its economy without external support. China provides that support through trade that violates sanctions, energy supplies, and diplomatic protection at the UN Security Council. The relationship isn't one-directional charity. China gains influence over North Korean behavior, the ability to moderate Kim's provocations when useful, and to deploy North Korean threats when pressure on South Korea or Japan serves Chinese interests. North Korea provides China with a buffer state, preventing American-aligned South Korea from sharing a border with China. And North Korean nuclear weapons create complications for American strategy in Asia that benefit China indirectly. Beyond these core bilateral relationships, the network includes nodes across regions. Russia maintains close ties with Syria's Assad, providing military support that kept Assad in power during the civil war. When Syrian protests in 2011 evolved into civil war threatening Assad's regime, Russia intervened decisively in 2015 with air power, special forces, and military advisors that turned the war in Assad's favor. The Syrian intervention demonstrated network coordination at scale. Russia provided air power and military expertise. Iran sent Revolutionary Guard forces and coordinated Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon. These combined forces stabilized Assad's position when rebel forces controlled significant Syrian territory and regime collapse seemed possible. The intervention succeeded not just militarily, but in demonstrating that network members would commit substantial resources to prevent a member regime's overthrow. The message to other autocratic leaders was clear: maintain network relationships, and you can access this kind of support if threatened. This creates powerful incentives for authoritarian regimes to deepen coordination even when immediate threats aren't present. The network is insurance that becomes valuable during crises. Iran and Russia coordinate on Middle East policy, Syrian intervention, and sanctions evasion. Venezuela under Maduro demonstrates how network support sustains regimes that would otherwise collapse under Western pressure. When the United States imposed comprehensive sanctions on Venezuela and recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as legitimate president, Maduro's regime faced potential economic and political collapse. But Russia and China provided crucial lifelines. China had invested heavily in Venezuelan oil infrastructure and held billions in Venezuelan debt. Rather than write off these investments when Venezuela faced crisis, China provided additional financing and continued purchasing Venezuelan oil despite American sanctions. Russia sent military advisors, security contractors, and equipment that strengthened Maduro's security forces. Both nations provided diplomatic support, vetoing UN Security Council resolutions that would have increased international pressure. The network support worked. Maduro survived despite hyperinflation, economic collapse, and mass emigration. The opposition movement fragmented. Guaidó's international recognition proved meaningless without the capacity to actually govern. Network support, Chinese financing, Russian security expertise, diplomatic protection from both provided enough resources for Maduro to maintain power despite catastrophic economic conditions and popular opposition. This demonstrates the network's effectiveness even in extreme cases. Venezuela's economy contracted over 70% between 2013 and 2020, one of the most severe peacetime economic collapses in modern history. Popular support for Maduro was minimal. American pressure was comprehensive, but network support was sufficient for regime survival. This creates powerful demonstration effects for other autocratic leaders. Maintain network relationships and you can survive even catastrophic conditions. The mechanisms of coordination are diverse and adapt to specific situations. Military cooperation is extensive. Russia and China conduct joint exercises that demonstrate interoperability and signal their military partnership to potential adversaries. Russia supplies weapons to autocratic regimes that Western nations refuse to arm: Syria, Myanmar, various African dictatorships. China exports surveillance technology, facial recognition systems, social media monitoring tools, telecommunications infrastructure with surveillance capabilities to dozens of authoritarian governments. Chinese surveillance technology exports have created a global infrastructure of digital authoritarianism. Huawei telecommunications equipment with built-in surveillance capabilities operates in over 170 countries. Chinese facial recognition systems monitor populations in Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and Ecuador. Social media monitoring platforms developed in China help autocratic governments track dissent in real time. This technology transfer isn't just commercial, it's strategic, creating dependencies where recipient governments rely on Chinese technology and expertise for regime security. The technology also creates data flows back to China. Equipment monitoring populations in other countries can provide intelligence to Chinese security services. This creates network effects where China gains from surveillance happening globally, not just domestically. And recipient governments become invested in maintaining relationships with China because their surveillance infrastructure depends on Chinese support and updates. The information sharing is particularly valuable. Protest suppression tactics developed in one country spread throughout the network. When Hong Kong protests threatened Chinese control, Belarus observed Chinese tactics. China deployed overwhelming police presence, comprehensive surveillance, targeted arrests of protest leaders, and legislative changes that criminalized dissent. The protests were gradually suppressed through exhaustion. Protesters couldn't sustain mobilization against state resources. Belarus took notes. When Belarus faced protests in 2020, Lukashenko applied methods that combined Chinese surveillance technology with Russian security force techniques. Belarusian security forces used facial recognition systems to identify protesters. They conducted targeted arrests based on social media monitoring. They deployed riot police trained by Russian advisors. The combination of Chinese technology and Russian tactical expertise allowed Lukashenko to suppress protests that had mobilized hundreds of thousands. When Venezuela's Maduro faced popular resistance, Cuban security advisors and Russian military contractors provided expertise drawn from multiple network members' experiences. Financial coordination helps members evade Western sanctions. When Russia faced sanctions after Crimea annexation and again after Ukraine invasion, Chinese banks provided alternative financial channels. Russian energy exports that Western buyers sanctioned found purchasers in China, India, and other nations willing to defy Western pressure. Venezuela's sanctioned oil found buyers through Russian intermediaries. Iran's sanctioned financial transactions flowed through Russian and Chinese banks. The diplomatic dimension provides crucial protection. UN Security Council vetoes by Russia and China shield network members from international accountability. When the US and European nations seek Security Council resolutions condemning Syria's chemical weapons use, Russian vetoes block action. When the West pursues accountability for Myanmar's Rohingya genocide, Chinese diplomatic protection prevents meaningful international response. This diplomatic cover is existentially valuable for regimes facing international condemnation. The propaganda coordination is increasingly sophisticated. Russian and Chinese state media amplify each other's narratives. When Russia justifies Ukraine invasion with claims about NATO expansion and Western aggression, Chinese media repeats these arguments. When China defends Xinjiang policies against genocide accusations, Russian media supports Chinese positions. Iranian media aligns with Russian and Chinese narratives on Western imperialism. The mutual reinforcement creates information ecosystems where autocratic regimes validate each other's propaganda. The benefits network members derive are substantial and explain why authoritarian leaders invest heavily in maintaining these relationships, despite the risks and costs. Security is the most obvious benefit. Authoritarian regimes face threats from popular uprisings, external military pressure, and assassination plots. Network membership provides multiple forms of security support. Russia sent security forces to help Lukashenko suppress Belarus protests. China provides North Korea with the economic support needed to prevent collapse that could trigger regime change. Syria's Assad survived only because Russian military intervention prevented rebel victory. Economic benefits are equally important. Authoritarian regimes often face Western sanctions that threaten economic collapse. Network membership provides alternative markets, financial channels, and economic support that reduce vulnerability. Russia redirected energy exports from Europe to China and India. Iran evades sanctions through Russian and Chinese financial cooperation. Venezuela survives American sanctions through Russian and Chinese economic support. Diplomatic protection at international institutions shields members from accountability. The UN Security Council veto power that Russia and China wield prevents resolutions that would authorize intervention, impose additional sanctions, or create international tribunals to prosecute regime crimes. This protection is invaluable for leaders who might otherwise face international justice. Technological access provides capabilities that strengthen regime control. Chinese surveillance technology allows autocratic governments to monitor populations comprehensively. Russian cyber capabilities and information warfare techniques enhance other regimes' ability to control narratives and suppress dissent. Military technology transfers from Russia and China enable autocratic regimes to resist external pressure. Legitimacy through mutual recognition matters more than Western observers often appreciate. When Western nations condemn an autocratic regime, the unified support from other autocratic governments provides alternative international legitimacy. The message is, the West condemns us, but major powers like Russia and China support us, demonstrating that Western moral claims aren't universally accepted. But the network also has significant vulnerabilities and limitations that prevent it from becoming a truly cohesive alliance comparable to NATO or historical treaty organizations. Trust is the fundamental problem. Network members don't trust each other. They coordinate based on overlapping interests against common threats. But those interests can diverge quickly. Russia and China maintain the appearance of close partnership, but deep strategic competition exists. Russia fears long-term Chinese demographic and economic expansion into Russia's underpopulated Far East. China views Russia as a declining power, useful for balancing against America, but not a long-term equal partner. Historical enmity complicates many relationships. Russia and China fought border wars in 1969. Their ideological split during the Cold War was profound and bitter. The current coordination is pragmatic, not based on genuine partnership. If circumstances change, if Russia weakens further, if Chinese interests in Central Asia conflict with Russian influence, the coordination could collapse quickly. Competing interests create constant tension. Turkey and Russia coordinate on Syria but back opposite sides in Libya and Azerbaijan. Iran and Russia cooperate in Syria but compete for influence. China and Russia both seek influence in Central Asian states, creating potential conflicts. India participates selectively in coordination with Russia while deepening security relationships with America through the Quad. These competing interests mean the network can coordinate on specific issues but can't develop the comprehensive integration that characterizes genuine alliances. Domestic instability within member states creates risks. If Lukashenko falls despite Russian support, Belarus could democratize and leave the network. If economic collapse or popular uprising overthrows Maduro in Venezuela, the network loses a foothold in Latin America. If protests in Iran achieve regime change, the Middle East node weakens. The network is only as stable as its most vulnerable members, and many face serious domestic challenges. Western pressure specifically targets network relationships. Sanctions often aim to raise the costs of cooperation between autocratic regimes. Secondary sanctions threaten entities that do business with sanctioned states, trying to force a choice between Western markets and network relationships. While these sanctions haven't broken the network, they increase the costs of cooperation and create pressure points. The ideological diversity within the network limits coordination depth. China's technocratic authoritarianism differs fundamentally from North Korea's personalist totalitarianism, Russia's kleptocratic authoritarianism, and Venezuela's populist authoritarianism. These different regime types have different interests, different vulnerabilities, and different priorities that complicate coordination beyond opposing common threats. Military limitations are significant. Unlike NATO's integrated military command structure, interoperable equipment, and coordinated planning, the autocratic network's military cooperation is limited. Joint exercises are mostly symbolic. Equipment isn't standardized. No integrated command structure exists. If the network faced coordinated military pressure, members couldn't provide the collective defense that NATO's Article 5 theoretically guarantees. Trump's relationship with this network represents something historically unusual, a democratic leader operating within autocratic coordination patterns. Trump's calls to Putin before meeting Zelensky, his praise of authoritarian leaders, his attacks on democratic allies, and his apparent preference for personal relationships with dictators over institutional relationships with democracies all suggest affinity for autocratic network operating styles. This creates profound complications. When a leader of a democracy coordinates with autocratic networks rather than democratic alliances, it undermines the democratic alliance system while strengthening autocratic coordination. Trump's NATO skepticism weakened the democratic alliance. His coordination with Putin strengthened Putin's position. His praise of Xi, Kim, and other dictators provided them with legitimacy while straining American relationships with democracies. The contrast with democratic coordination is instructive. Democratic leaders coordinate through transparent, rules-based institutions. NATO meetings are public. G7 summits are announced. Democratic coordination happens within frameworks of law, treaty obligations, and public accountability. Leaders answer to legislatures, courts, and voters for their international commitments. Autocratic coordination happens privately, personally, and without accountability. The calls between Putin and Xi aren't announced in advance. The commitments aren't public. The leaders answer to no one for what they promise or how they coordinate. This opacity allows flexibility but also enables coordination that democratic oversight would prevent. The network's future trajectory depends on several factors. If autocratic regimes face increasing domestic instability, the network's value increases as regimes need mutual support for survival. But instability also creates fragility. If key members fall, the network weakens. If Western pressure intensifies through coordinated sanctions and diplomatic isolation, network coordination might deepen as members have no alternative. But pressure could also fracture the network by raising costs of cooperation. Economic factors will matter enormously. If China's economy slows significantly, its ability to provide economic support to network members decreases. If energy prices decline, Russia's economic capacity weakens. If Western economies successfully reduce dependence on Chinese manufacturing, leverage over China increases. Economic trends will determine whether the network can sustain members facing sanctions and domestic economic challenges. Technological developments could either strengthen or weaken the network. Advances in surveillance technology that network members share strengthen regime control, but technologies that enable secure communications for protesters or that bypass regime censorship undermine autocratic control. The technological competition between regime control tools and resistance tools will shape network effectiveness. Leadership changes create uncertainty. Putin has led Russia for over 2 decades and personally drives much network coordination. If Putin exits power through death, coup, or political change, Russian network participation could shift dramatically. Similarly, Xi's eventual succession in China will test whether network coordination survives leadership transitions or depends on personal relationships. The autocratic network exists because authoritarian leaders face common threats: domestic accountability pressures, international condemnation, economic isolation, potential intervention, and gain from coordination against these threats. As long as those threats exist, and network membership provides valuable protection, the coordination will continue. But the network's limitations mean it can't replicate the depth of coordination that characterizes democratic alliances at their best. Trust is absent. Competing interests create friction. The lack of formal structures means commitments are unreliable. Members cooperate opportunistically, but can't depend on each other the way NATO members theoretically can. The question is whether this opportunistic coordination is sufficient for autocratic regimes to collectively resist democratic pressure and maintain power. Recent history suggests it often is. Assad survived. Lukashenko survived. Maduro survived. Kim remains in power. Network support helped each survive challenges that might have toppled them individually. This means the network is functional even if not formalized. It operates effectively enough to serve member interests even without the institutional depth of democratic alliances. And as long as it provides value, security support, economic lifelines, diplomatic protection, technological capabilities, autocratic leaders will phone each other first, coordinate privately, and build the shadow alliance that operates beneath the surface of formal international relations. When Trump calls Putin before meeting Zelensky, he's not just making a phone call. He's participating in a network of coordination that operates fundamentally differently from democratic alliance systems. The pattern is revealing. Trump spoke with Putin for hours. By his own admission, 2.5 hours in one conversation, multiple calls on the same day. He coordinated Russian positions before meeting with Ukraine's president. This isn't alliance management. It's network coordination where one leader ensures another's interests are considered before engaging with someone whose interests conflict. Compare this to how democratic leaders coordinate. When Biden meets with Zelensky, he consults NATO allies publicly, coordinates positions through formal alliance structures, and operates within frameworks of transparency and shared decision-making. The coordination happens through institutional channels with public accountability. Trump's approach, private calls with Putin, personal coordination without institutional involvement, prioritizing autocratic relationships over democratic alliances, reflects network operating logic rather than alliance frameworks. Understanding that network, how it functions, what it provides, and what limits it, is essential to understanding how power actually operates in the contemporary world. The network exists beneath formal international institutions. It operates through personal relationships rather than treaty obligations. It coordinates flexibly based on shared interests rather than binding commitments. And it provides autocratic leaders with resources, security support, economic lifelines, diplomatic protection, technological capabilities that enable regime survival despite domestic opposition and international pressure. The network isn't going away. As long as autocratic regimes face common threats and gain from coordination, they'll maintain these relationships. The calls will continue, the coordination will deepen, and the shadow alliance will operate beneath the surface, shaping global politics in ways that democratic institutions struggle to counter.